Hi, everyone. My name is Leanne Kim, and on behalf of the Women's Museum of California, I would like to welcome you to this conversation about the powerful, award-winning documentary, Sisters Rising, one of 3 films presented by the museum this month as part of its virtual summer film series. I want to acknowledge that I join you from the ancestral land of the Kumeyaay people, and tonight we honor their legacy. We would also like to recognize the San Diego chapter of the National Organization for Women. Thank you so much, San Diego Now, for sponsoring this film and this panel discussion. And to those of you who are joining us live online, we encourage you to share your thoughts in your comments in the chat box. And if you have a specific question for our panelists, you could also throw that into our chat box as well. Now it's time to introduce our 3 guests. First, I'd like to welcome Willow O'Ferrell. She is an award-winning director, producer, cinematographer, triple threat. Willow is a member of New Day Films, the longest-running distribution cooperative for independent documentary filmmakers in the U.S. And she joins us live from her home in Vermont, where it is 9:30 at night. Willow, thank you so much for being here with us. Good to see you.
So good to see you, Leanne. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We love your film, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Next, we have Lisa Bruner. She is one of the main subjects of the film. Lisa is a member of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation and is Wolf Clan. Lisa has worked in domestic violence and the sexual assault field for over 20 years. And currently she is the director of the Cultural Department and director of Community Extension Service Department and faculty at White Earth Tribal and Community College. And she joins us live from Minnesota. Lisa, it's so good to see you. Excited that you can join us as well.
Leanne Kim for the, oh, am I? Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. But miigwech for the invitation and just very honored and pleased to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And our third guest is Wendy Schlater, Vice-Chairwoman for the La Jolla Band of Luiseño Indians, Board Director for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, Program Director for her tribe's Avelica program, which also serves domestic violence and sexual assault victims. And she actively participates on the National Congress of American Indians Violence Against Native Women's Task Force. Wendy is joining us live from the La Jolla Indian Reservation in North County, San Diego. Beautiful backdrop there. Wendy, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. And so I'm so excited to have these strong sisters here tonight to talk to us and talk about a small world. Wendy and Lisa, before we even put this panel together, I didn't know that you both knew each other from the work that you were doing with all of your advocacy. So it's wonderful that you all know each other as well.
Small world.
Small world. Well, so here's what's going to happen. We're going to spend the first half of this conversation focusing on the making of the film with Willow and Lisa. And Wendy, I'll bring you in on the second half to help us localize some of these topics. And then you can also chime in on the important work that you're doing here in San Diego County. So we'll see you in a bit. You can stand by and enjoy the first half of the conversation. So Willow and Lisa, so excited to talk to you. Willow, congratulations. This film has been a labor of love for you, and you've won 4 awards. Even through the pandemic, you were able to show this film virtually. Most recently, you won Best Film at the Women's Voices Now Festival in California. Tell us a little bit about the journey. Why this particular subject? And, you know, you followed 6 women, including Lisa. So tell us why the subject and how did you find your subjects here?
So let's see, we started this film, I think I've been saying 6 years for a while now, so it might be a little more than 6 years, but I'm going to stick with 6. And I was living in New York at this time. I'm now living in Vermont, but I was part of an all-women's Afro-Brazilian samba reggae drum corps.
Wow.
It was like 60 women. It was amazing, super diverse group of women, like all ages from teenager to quite elderly. And they were always sharing like resources, ideas, interesting projects, stories. And one of them shared Patty Stonefish's Indigenous Women's Self-Defense course. and she was doing sort of a fundraiser for it online. And I was through Patty's kind of project, I learned about the issues of violence against Native women, which I had not known about that much before, in fact, at all, which it was really shocking to me because I really care about, women's safety and anti-racist work and stuff like that. So I was like, how did I not know about this? And so Brad, my partner, and I started talking to Patty about working with her to make some sort of documentary, and we went out to Fargo and met her, and then the project kind of exploded into this constellation of 6 women. It was a bit of an accident, but it was a happy accident because we met all these incredible women, a lot of them based on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in northwestern North Dakota, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. But we also, I think we were able to meet Lisa through Patty because she taught a workshop on White Earth, on the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, and we met Lisa Bruner through Patty's. I think that's how it worked out. Everyone, when we asked, like, who should we meet on White Earth, everyone was like, Lisa Bruner. So yeah, multiple people pointing us in her direction.
Well, and I love how you described it as a constellation, because each one of those stories, there's a through line, but they're also very, very unique too. And Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your story. What are your thoughts of being invited to participate in this film? Because you shared some very, very personal stories, including how your advocacy began at the tender age of 4 after watching your mom be brutally attacked by your stepfather. What was that like to be invited to share the story on video, on film with the rest of the world?
It's for a lot of survivors, and it can be kind of scary. It can be who's going to see this. I'm worried about what's going to happen in our community if they see this, or more so within my family if they see this. So at first you kind of have that hesitation of should I be telling my story? There are others that have far worse maybe stories. Those types of things all kind of come to the forefront, but then my advocacy kicks in, and so it's important that we tell our stories, because in truth there's power, and in words, when we breathe life into those words, there's power. And so it's always a healing moment, and to be able to share and be able to tell these particular stories. And at the same time, for those that are hearing it for the first time or are currently our victims, it's good for them to know and to feel that they're not alone, that they're not the only ones, that there is help available, and they can get to a place where they are safe, where they're no longer going to be abused.
Mm-hmm. Willow, as you were doing this, shooting this film, Laureline, and I'm sure even with Lisa and the other subjects in the film, they talked about how storytelling is an important part of Native American culture and how important it is for them to say it out loud. And Laureline, we caught her in the moment actually saying things for the first time ever. And we're literally on camera watching the layers of the onion being peeled in front of our very eyes. What was that like for you as a director?
It was really powerful. It was really overwhelming for me. I mean, I remember, I think, so that interview with Laureline, I think it was 4 hours or maybe even longer. And remember Brad and I, so we were staying, anyways, Fort Berthold Reservation is very, very large. And we would drive like over an hour to find Laureline on one end of the reservation, which was separate from where we were staying. And it was a long trek. And I remember we were driving back, through the plains after, just crying, processing as we're driving away from that interview, And then this huge thunderstorm rolled in. I mean, unbelievable. I know that, like, I did not grow up in the Midwest. I'm not super familiar with it. Brad is, he's from Illinois, but I was just like, there was lightning zigzagging sideways across the sky. I'd never seen anything like it. It was totally enveloping, and then crazy hail. And this was in the middle of summer. And we pulled over and like crawled into the back of our car and just like cuddled together and cried and held each other while everything is like storming and lightning. And that I felt was like, this is not a metaphor. This is the reality. This is reality. But it was also mirroring kind of how we were feeling. And I think we finally made it back to our hotel room and slept for like 14 hours straight because I was so overwhelmed. It was really, really intense. And it was really overwhelming to me. It was an overwhelming sense of responsibility that was sometimes terrifying. I mean, Lisa is talking about the vulnerability, and, you know, you're placing a lot of trust in someone when you tell them your story. And I knew that the women in Sisters Rising were placing enormous trust in me, and that made me scared because I was like, what if I don't do right, you know, by these stories? And especially hearing from Laureline when she said some of these things I've never said out loud, I was just like, oh my God, it felt like a heavy burden, you know. I wanted to do right. And I think that's partly why it took so many years to edit, was just that it took a while to make sure we were doing right.
And just to be clear and transparent, Willow, you are not Native American, and neither is Brad, the co-director and your partner. And so with that said, Lisa, how do you feel about a non-Native person telling this story? And how did you build that trust with Willow to, you know, be vulnerable and you know, share your story with somebody who is from outside of your community?
When you meet Willow and Brad, you see their authenticity. You see that they are genuinely very good, spirited people. And they have an incredible skill set, and this is a gift. And I believe that when people or things come into your life, it's opening a door. And so I never really knew where this was, you know, going to end up, or how, you know, how it was going to be. I mean, to be winning awards and here we are having a talkback. I had no really huge expectations. My only hope and goal was that it would be used in an educational purpose to be able to help raise the awareness, right? Because you know, prior to this, you shared Leonie didn't know, and how Willow and Brad did not know, and how important and illuminating that is, because we're invisible here on our own lands. As Native people, we're invisible. And so I really appreciate and adore and love both Willow and Brad, because they did do right by the film, and because it was with a good heart and a good mind that they did that. And they always made sure they asked questions, you know, just making sure that they were doing right by it.
So it sounds like it was a real collaborative process that they brought you all along, and over 6 years, that's a long time to collaborate on something. Ultimately, Lisa, what were your thoughts on the final product? Because, you know, squeezing in 6 stories in 60 minutes, that's a lot of editing that they had to do on their end. How do you feel with the final product that you saw?
I could duck out so Lisa can really speak her mind.
I thought it was, you know, artistically that they did a fantastic job. You have the music and all of their videoing and all of the things that they captured, and the threading. I think that's the most key and most critical part of any type of documentary, especially in something like this, is threading, and tying and weaving those stories together in a very good way. So that it became, you know, creates this strong basket, right? And so that's what they did. That's how I see it.
I feel that way too. I mean, Willow, do you feel like 60 minutes was enough time? Is there going to be like a part 2, part 3? I'm sure you have hundreds of hours of content after 6 years of working on this film.
Yeah, there's so many. There were even women that we spent time with that aren't in the final film, because we were really like, wow, 6 women in 60 minutes is really pushing it, in terms of it was really tight, and most people would not. They would say like, no, maybe three people in 1 hour, but 6, are you kidding me? So we had to leave a lot of material on the cutting room floor. And looking back, it's always funny looking in the rear view mirror. You can say whatever you want, but I would say that if I had had more time and more funding and stuff, maybe I think we would have loved to make a 2-hour maybe festival cut and then do the 1 hour PBS cut, because it could have. I think my main critique of the film is that I wish it had a little more breathing space, and a little bit more time to hang out with all 6 women in the film, having time with their family and doing more, like Lisa rollerblading was just like, I was like, yeah, we are going to fit that in the film. I don't care how far off it is from our topic. Like, it's going in there, more moments of joy, just giving people a little bit more breathing room, which we did the best we could within 1 hour. But if we had expanded it to 2 hours, I think it would have had a little bit more air, more lungs to it. But I'm proud of it. I knew, I was so scared of making one of those films where people are like yawning and they're like, God, why didn't someone edit this better? So we edited it very tightly, because we didn't want any second to be, fluff. And I definitely think it's no fluff, but I'm kind of like, yeah, I could use a little bit of like a little bit more fluff, maybe a tiny bit, but
I appreciate too that there were these brief moments of levity, like Lisa talking about speeding through some place to get someplace, and then the rollerblading and all that kind of stuff, because we need that to balance out how heavy this is, right? I think the statement was that I wrote it down here about how ending rape is connected to tribal sovereignty. And that's a huge statement. I mean, how it's all connected, and it's so heavy that you do need to balance it out. So, Lisa, how you do this work as a career? Willow was only making this as a film. You do this day in, day out. You've lived it from the time you were a child. How do you handle your own kind of self-care to stay in and be determined to stay in this work? It must take so much energy.
It does. So like for self-care, one, I'm a mother. I have 3 grown children. I have 6 grandchildren.
Wow, congrats.
Thank you. So they, just seeing the beauty of their innocence and just their little fat chubbiness, or it's the only time when being fat and chubby is cute. But it's just, enjoying my family and being able to, first and foremost, knowing that I stopped that. I stopped that cycle of violence within my family, so that my children would have never had to experience anything like that, or to know that. So that gives me strength and the things that I need to do to carry forward, and knowing that we can stop this. And with one person in a single generation, we can stop this. So, I guess one is just to knowing that there's hope that we can end this level of violence, because I have 3 grandsons and I have 3 granddaughters, 2 of which are like adopted, and my little granddaughter who's 8 months old. And the hope is, and the drive is, so that they're not telling these stories, so that the words that they're breathing life into are going to be better stories than what I've ever experienced. And my daughters have been able to tell part of that to a degree. So we still have a lot more work to do. And of course, I was rollerblading, and I paint, and I have a dog that argues with me.
So you're like, you have a normal life, outside of all of this. And I think that's really important. And there's hope too, right? There's hope in that there has been some progression. We have Native Americans at the federal government now. You know, how is it the Housing Interior Department as well as in Congress? And then also there's been a little bit of movement with VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act. Lisa, I know that you've been following this and you are a part of this effort. What's going on with VAWA? Because you were saying that this can end, and I'm sure that, are you referring to VAWA, like from a policy standpoint?
What I'm saying is that the violence can end against women, right? It can end especially against our Native women. So VAWA is definitely a piece to that. That's, you know, that's federal law. And it's been a very long, incredible adventure, if you will, or journey to have VAWA to be where it's at today. But what Congress has demonstrated is that as quickly and as hard as it took, so it took us 10 years to get to VAWA 2013, where our tribes can now exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-natives who commit acts of violence against our women for domestic violence, dating violence, in order for protection. That's it. But that took us over 10 years in our advocacy with our tribal coalitions to do that. And just like that, with a very unhealthy Congress and administration, that they could stop that. That they can very easily strip things. They you know, it can change. So I don't think we should be putting all of our eggs in the basket. And for us, especially as Native people, or people of color for that matter, expecting this United States to create a system that's going to defend and protect us versus hunting and persecuting us, and doing very little to protect us. Because I don't know if you know, Leanne, but is that our tribes do not, up until in 1978, you had Congress, and this is what Sarah talks about, strips all of, you know, in Oliphant, stripped our tribes of criminal jurisdiction. And even though VAWA passed in 2013, you have 570 plus federally recognized tribes in the country, and maybe a handful, I don't know, maybe 15 or so, or 13, 15, actually can exercise that criminal jurisdiction. The rest of our tribes don't have that capacity, because it has to do with money for building the infrastructures to be able to do that. So it's a very incredible challenge. So VAWA is just a piece to it. There are many other moving parts. You have like the Tribal Law and Order Act that passed in 2010 under Obama, that increased our sentencing authority. On our reservations, you want to know what what we can sentence for rape or murder? 1 year, and or $5,000 fine.
Yeah, I remember hearing that in the movie. That was really horrifying.
That's it.
Yeah.
FLOA increased it to 3 years and or $15,000 fine, or both. It's not a significant increase. Of course, we can stack it to 9 years, but still, it's what we need to be protected is very minute. Because I was actually in another play called Sliver of a Full Moon, and it got its title for me because I was asked, you know, what does VAWA mean to you? So this is, you know, on the crux of VAWA passing in 2013, and I was at the Native American Smithsonian in DC, and I happened to look out the window, and it was this big, beautiful moon just low, and I said, it's just a sliver of a full moon of what we need to be protected. And so we can't depend on this government to protect us. We've been waiting for over 500 years.
Right. So, but you're absolutely right, and thank you for pointing that out. I think, you know, another step is through this movie, right, which is such a unique movie. I was kind of Googling like films about Native American women, and there just aren't that many out there, if any at all. So, I mean, Willow, you and Lisa are part of something that is a very important part of raising awareness, right, and a collective consciousness that needs to happen for change to occur, right? I don't know, did you know that you were doing this, Willow, as you were making this film? You know, how important it was, because this is not something artistically that has been made before.
Yeah, I guess I didn't think about that so much. I I'm sort of hung up on the whole sliver of a full moon idea right now, thinking about what Lisa said. That's another thing I think about Sisters Rising sometimes, is like, we really wanted to focus on actionable change so that people would watch the film and then feel like they could take some concrete steps towards making positive change. And so we did kind of do this little plug near the end of, you know, tribal sovereignty is necessary to end rape of Native women, and which Sarah Deer says so beautifully. But I also feel like there's so many other things, like the rest of the full moon that Lisa's talking about, that is important, like, you know, rooting out racism and sexism sort of at its root is really, really important. And that's not only white culture, but it's also in every community in the United States has racism and sexism steeped into it at this point, you know? And so there is so much work that needs to be done, and it can't just be reduced to jurisdictional issues or federal change, though that is very important. But sometimes I wonder if we should have stressed more other ways in which we can address this issue aside from just legislative change.
Well, you only had 60 minutes, Willow. You can't do it all, right?
You keep trying to compliment me, and I'm like, well, actually, I'm going to complain about it.
Woulda, coulda, but you know, I think that you had a very specific focus in this particular film, and women who are connected to that focus, and not just, you know, these 6 women, but as you mentioned in those, you know, statistics at the very beginning of the film, this issue touches almost every Native American woman in this country, right? And certainly these topics are also very relevant to us here in San Diego County. I want to bring in Wendy to join us in this conversation. You know, San Diego County has more Indian reservations than any other county in the United States. And Wendy, you have also been working for many years. You've dedicated your life towards service in protecting and uplifting Native American people here in San Diego County. I wanted to get your reaction to the film and your biggest takeaways from Sisters Rising.
Yeah, thank you, Leanne. And thank you, Willow and Lisa, for sharing your work and your story with us, in particular, Lisa, and the other women as well. A special shout out to the Haskell girls out in Kansas, because I know there's a group of young Native American girls watching this podcast as we speak. I know. So, Kim, Leanne, I would like to just take us through a brief timeline of our movement, right? So in the 1970s, we had women helping women. This was, Indigenous, Native women, women of color, white women coming together and just saying no more, no more of this. We need federal legislation passed. And so they started to gather and advocate at the congressional level for domestic violence to stop. And in the 1980s, we see our first federal legislation in 1984, I believe, with the FIPS office, the Family Violence Prevention Services Act. And what that did was it actually started to provide resources for shelter services, safe houses, and educational services as well. But in 1974, the state of California adopted its first domestic violence law, but it was only after a lawsuit, a 1972 lawsuit of a wrongful death of a woman who kept calling law enforcement for protection from her abusive husband. And so in 1974, we see California pass its first domestic violence law, but it was only for folks that were married. So it didn't cover, intimate partner violence or dating violence or any other scenario there. And then in the 1990s, we see the passage of VAWA in 1994 with Bill Clinton's administration and Joe Biden, our current president, sponsoring and authoring that legislation to go through. So from 1994, then you start to see the states really address domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, and human trafficking is not even really on the radar yet at that time in 1994. So if you think about like about that history of United States becoming a nation in 1776, expanding itself across, America, Turtle Island, and then, California joined the statehood in 1850. It's just like, where this country's priorities are in protecting its women and children. It's very low on the scale. And so it took a group of women from all different backgrounds to come together in the 1970s and lead that movement. And since then, we've been having landmark legislative successes and getting more appropriations, more laws passed. But with that same breath, Native country hasn't been able to be carried with that, right? Mm-hmm. And so not until 2005 that the Native women came together, our Indigenous sisters came together and advocated for the Safety for Native Women's Act in VAWA, which included tribal-specific resources for tribal governments to now start providing the education, the awareness, create laws, have access to tribal law enforcement dollars to develop their own law enforcement on their reservations. But it was still restricted, right? It was still restricted. So that's why these films that Willow and Lisa and the other sisters have created, and Mary Catherine Nagel with Sliver of a Full Moon, these stories that are put together to tell our legacy of resistance against this type of violence. Because when you really look into domestic violence and you see non-natives put these history lines together, it's tracked all the way from Europe and across the oceans and came over here. It's not to say that our people were perfect. We're not, we're far from, but there were harsh consequences within our community that there was very little of that. But, today, as reading a report from the VAWA toolkit that, I hope everyone downloads. And, some of the statistics is, 84.3 of American Indian and Alaska Native women, more than four and five have experienced intimate partner violence, sexual violence or stalking in their lifetimes. 96% of female American Indian, Alaska Native sexual violent victims experience violence at the hands of their non-native perpetrators. And so this film really shows an example of Native women are not like beaten because we're Native and murdered. We're murdered and we're beaten. And Lisa, I heard you say this, so I'm giving you credit for this tagline, is because there's lack of laws, lack of resources that are coming into Indian country to really address this work. And so, if perpetrator and an abuser and a predator knows where to go hunt for their victim, knowing that, the local tribal government's hands are tied because it's caught up in jurisdiction, it's caught up in case law. We all have targets on our backs, right? And so, with these successes of the VAWA reauthorization of 2013, which gave us partial jurisdiction over, and what Lisa shared earlier, of domestic violence cases, and that was only for, that's only for non-natives. Now, if they sexually assaulted their partner, which sexual assault goes along with domestic violence, they can't, the tribal courts and law enforcement can't write a citation for that. Tribal courts can't prosecute for that because those other violent crimes were not included. So with this new push for VAWA Reauth in 2021, we're pushing for all of those to be covered. The stalking, the dating violence, the sexual assault, the sex trafficking, the human trafficking, the abuse on children and elders, and then also for our court bailiffs to be protected. There's just so much work to be done. And given the timing of everything, how does a film like this play into those advocacy efforts? I'm sure that
it helps. Unfortunately, it was during a pandemic, but on the flip side, it does kind of, you wonder if more people have been watching because of the fact that we've been kind of stuck at home watching films. But the timing of this movie coming out and the timing of the latest VAWA efforts, do they kind of play in with one another?
Oh, absolutely. So this film will be great to educate our non-native relatives, right? Anyone who wants to get involved can go to ncai.org and search the VAWA toolkit, and that will give you a play script on how to call your senators to get VAWA reauth passed. So we have successfully passed VAWA through the House, through Congress, and now it's time to get on the senators to pass VAWA with all those provisions in it. And so I encourage everyone to go to ncai.org and search for the VAWA toolkit, and that'll give you all the statistics, the script on when you call your senator's office to support the SB. They haven't even given it a number yet to go in, but the House has done their job. Congress has done their job in passing VAWA reauth. Now it's time to get the Senate moving on in.
Willow, I think you were gonna say a little something about the timing of this film.
Oh yeah, just echoing Wendy. Yes, we're hoping that this film helps raise awareness and is sort of like a fire, lights a fire under everyone's butt to get the VAWA reauthorization passed with these tribal provisions in place. And it might be redundant because maybe Wendy suggested the NCII toolkit is probably the same thing, but All My Relations podcast is an amazing podcast made by some badass Native women, and they have on their website, it's allmyrelationspodcast.com /VAWA letter. You can also, it's just a form letter, and you can basically plug in your senator and it will send off, basically telling your senator you really want VAWA reauthorization to be passed. So that's a helpful, it's a helpful kind of no-brainer thing where you can just send it off and it's done. And I love that our representatives have to respond. It's like, it's nice because I'm like, Bernie Sanders isn't going to respond to me, but he always does when I'm pestering him about something.
That's good to know. That's really good to know. And
it's Schlatter, not him, but still, they have to log. They notice when people are really obsessed with one issue. They take note, and I think it bumps it to the top of the list. So your voice really does matter. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it does, but I think it does.
Okay, so that's one takeaway that everyone could do to support the cause, which is contacting our elected officials in Washington. And Willow, thank you so much for bringing up All My Relations podcast. There's, one of the reasons why people like you and I, Willow, didn't know about so much of this is because it's not taught in American history, and so we have to actually deliberately seek out real, authentic voices, people who are telling these particular stories. And, as the Women's Museum of California, we care very much in upholding and archiving women's stories. I wanted to ask, the panelists here about, there's been a long history of negative relations between the Native American people and traditional museums. Many of the artifacts that are in museums today have not been donated by Indigenous communities, but rather they have been taken. So for those who are supporters of the Women's Museum, I just wanted to throw it out there. How can we as a community, as a society, do a better job in honoring Native American history, experiences, and doing a better job in archiving it in a way that is respectful? So I just will throw that out to anyone, Lisa or Wendy, Willow.
Lisa, you mind if I go first? Okay. So basically, the Smithsonian Museum out in DC, that I think that went live, I think in 2003 or 2005, really did a good job in collecting those artifacts within other museums and repatriating them back to the tribes that they belong to and giving those back. And so when you see a display in the Smithsonian, the Smithsonian invites the tribe to come out and create their own wall to tell
Oh,
their
that's wonderful.
and so the Museum of Man, and I want to say in the last 5 years, has been doing a great job in following that example here in San Diego in Balboa Park, and repatriating bones and baskets and tools that we use to grind our acorns and take care of our village sites with, repatriating those back to the tribes as well. And so I think if any museum up and coming is work with the community and be respectful, and don't have a collection, have the collection come to you, and work with the community and on how that display and how they're going to tell their story.
It sounds so simple, doesn't it? It sounds like such a simple solution. Just invite those who you're trying to archive to be part of the process, or just don't do it, right? Lisa, do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, just the same thing is just, making sure if there are artifacts or things that need to be repatriated back to the tribes, don't make it a lengthy process. And, listen to the tribes and, just like what Wendy says, invite the tribes to come and tell their own stories. We know our own stories. We don't need other people to tell our stories for us, just to be respectful and mindful, and to, bring us back in the light that we're not stuck, in we're not antiquated, like the movies and sometimes things make us, right? We have actors, and we have, Deb Haaland, who is, with Department of Interior, right? How powerful is that? First ever. So we have doctors and lawyers and tribal chairs. So, we have amazing people, and just to bring us into the current century, in a positive way. So I think that would be great.
I think one of the stories that I'm really going to take away from this film is the concept of counting coup, right? Because, this whole film is about ending violence against women, and counting coup is about holding our enemy accountable without physical harm.
Mm-hmm.
There's something, very profound in that thought. And I just wanted to, ask you to expand on counting coup. And is this something, Lisa, that is just something that is special in your particular tribe, or is this something that is relatable across all Native American culture?
I can't speak for all Native American cultures, but I know that counting coup resonates with other tribes. The importance of showing that they can get that close, that they can touch them without harming them. It's about their stealth and their skill sets and their capabilities. I think is and without really doing anything to hurt them, but putting them on notice, right, that they could. So we're not the only ones with that with the counting coup concept or practice. And trust me, it takes a lot of personal control, restraint, critical thinking, and skill to be able to do that. So for me, that day, sharing that story, knowing that all of that rage, and this is what I had intended to do, to be able to critically think and realize that the ramifications would have impacted my mother, and obviously I ended up in jail, but so it's really important to have an understanding of we can take down our enemies without really having to touch them, and we can hold them accountable. It took a long time. It shouldn't have taken 40 plus years for the law to do just that for my mother that day. 40 plus years of beatings, that's not acceptable. That's not okay. So we have a long ways to go, but by no means do I not support. Obviously I do. I've been doing the work for advocacy for VAWA for many, many years for us to get our tribal Title IX in 2005, and then all the way up to the subsequent 2013. It's necessary, but we as a society really need to start examining ourselves and how we're treating each other, and how we so easily can trespass Mother Earth. And when we can trespass Mother Earth and do the things to her that we do, we're putting pipelines in her, we're digging her up, and we're blowing her up, and we're poisoning her. And when we can do that to her, it's so easy then to do that to women, all women, not just us as Native women. So we have a lot to, for humanity to wake up here, because we're in some serious trouble. And it's like even right now, our tribe is fighting Enbridge with Pipeline 3, and they just went and took millions of gallons of water in a severe drought from our lake that grows our sacred food, our wild rice. If we can't defend our land, how do we defend us? Right? That's where that sovereignty is. If we can defend our land, we can defend our people. We can defend our people, we can defend our land. But you can't do one without the other. So, and then the other thing I just want to kind of bring to light, especially when we're trying to address the issues of murdered and missing Indigenous women. 2016 statistics showed that 5,716 Native women had gone missing and are murdered. And this is kind of ties into my last statement in the film about being put on the endangered species list, is because at the time we were less than 1% of the total U.S. population, and so when our women who give birth to our nations and our future generations are being wiped out, that's a substantial amount from our people, from our tribes, because each tribe has different populations. Some have a couple 100,000, some only have a couple thousand, a couple 100,000 to that. So it can be really detrimental to our future generations. And so we're seeing, the boarding school era is not new to us. What the United States did to here with the churches that participated in these boarding schools. We're seeing residential schools up in Canada. The same thing happened there. It was to kill the Indian and save the man. This is where child abuse was taught, child sex abuse, all of these things that were occurring, and to strip us of our language, our culture, identity, us, right? And now they're finding all of these unmarked graves in some of these residential schools up in Canada. Right now it's like 300 and some just in 2. And so the United States has yet to atone for what they've done. They can say sorry all they want, but they have not been held accountable for what they did to our ancestors. I'm sure, Wendy, you are, but I'm a granddaughter of my grandmother and grandfather who were in that boarding school. And so, and all of the children that didn't make it home. And holding these churches accountable, these priests, these nuns that did these things. Anywhere else, they would be considered serial killers and murderers. But since it was government sanctioned and the churches did it, does not make it any less that of a serious crime of serial killing. So how do we address the murdered and missing Indigenous women of today that's going at such astronomical rates if we have yet to atone for what happened to the children of our nations? So the human trafficking that they did, so that there's an awful lot that needs to be done. So I really encourage people to Google, you can be your own best teacher, and just look up Native authors, Google Native authors, and take the time to start reading. Look up what the boarding school era is. Look up the residential schools. The same thing happened to the Indigenous people of Australia, happened in New Zealand. It wasn't just here on this continent, it was elsewhere. So we have a lot of work, humans. Relatives, we got a lot of work to do.
And that sounds like a whole other movie, right? Because, you know, Sisters Rising talks about one very specific part of the Native American experience, but we know that there is so much more trauma in its history that we need to unpack and that we need to learn and unlearn what is being taught in schools today. As we wrap up here, I wanted to ask each one of you about if there's anything that you want people to take away from this conversation. What is it that you want them to take away from either the conversation or the film? Let's start with you, Wendy, and then we'll go to Lisa, and then we'll end with Willow. Wendy, I think you are muted. There you go.
Okay. So for those of you that are watching and may have been triggered or are reminded of trauma, whether ancestral trauma or current trauma, I put in strongheartshelpline.org. You can call this hotline 24/7 and reach out to somebody and talk with them and get a real live counselor there, or you can chat with them on text. So Strong Hearts Helpline. What I would like for folks to take away from this time that we've spent together in the film is that violence against Native women, violence against women and children in general is a pandemic that we have not come out of yet. And we all need to band together and make sure that we get this next VAWA reauth passed through the Senate with all of its provisions in there, because there are some strong immigrant provisions in there. There's strong LGBTQ. There's strong child protection provisions in there, and there's strong Native American Indian country provisions in there. And we cannot accept anything less. Let me put it that way, from our leaders, from our national leaders, and you know, and be a good relative, because it is as simple as respecting one another and not using our hands or our words or our privilege to hurt one another, right? And you know, the solution is really simple, as Lisa mentioned earlier. That was evident in VAWA reauth of 2013, and so I'll pass it on to Lisa. Thank you.
Yes, I definitely echo Wendy. Make sure you do some self-care, do things that help you in a good way, because it is heavy for people who may have never even heard it, and especially for those who are survivors or having to be triggered by it. And so I guess the other takeaway would be, go and volunteer at your local domestic violence or sexual assault shelters and programs. They most certainly can use the help. This would be a very good place where you get a good understanding of how the system operates from the victim side and the barriers that many victims face. Please remember that nobody asked to be hurt. Nobody asked to be abused. Nobody deserves to be abused. Like Count Coup, as much as I felt he deserved it, when it came to it, he didn't. He needed to be held accountable, but not by me. So just make sure that, change the narrative and start using terms like men's use of violence against women. Don't say, but even though we're conditioned to do it, and I already did it, like 5,716 Native women are murdered and missing. Yes, but somebody, traffickers and rapists and murderers have done that. So change the narrative, because we focus on victim. Start calling out the things that you're seeing in your newspaper. Call your editors. Man who was caught having sex with an underage girl. No, a man raped a child. Because when they're changing the narratives, they're softening the blow, that creating the dialogue and the mind frame that this is a normal thing, and it's not. So start challenging what you're seeing, start challenging what you're hearing, and go volunteer, because they need your help. Miigwech. And thank you for joining us this evening and for watching the film.
Thank you, Lisa. That's all great advice. We all should give a little bit of time, energy, even money, right, to our domestic violence organizations and those who are working against sexual assault. Willow, what is it that you'd love for people to take away from this movie?
Yeah, I think most of it has been said, but echoing, I think, what both Wendy and Lisa have said is just furthering education, like rooting out racism in each of ourselves, I think is a lifetime of work. And reading Native authors, especially Native women, has been essential for me on my journey to making Sisters Rising, and it's been really eye-opening. And this, I'm always plugging Sarah Deer's book because it was like our holy grail book while we were making the film. And actually it goes back to, so Sarah Deer, who was in the film, if you've seen the film, then you know who she is. And this was her book that was published kind of in the middle of us making the film. But she actually talks about what Wendy was talking about, how tribes they treated the crime of rape very, very differently than the settler colonialists did coming from Europe, because in Europe, rape was treated as a crime against whoever owned the woman, so a woman's father or husband, it was a crime against him because she was essentially his property. And that mindset, which is so deeply sexist, was sort of exported from Europe when the settlers came to the US. And from what Sarah Deer's scholarship shows is that Native tribes had a very, very different attitude towards men and women. There wasn't this kind of property, women are property. There was not that idea. And so rape was considered an extremely heinous and very, very serious crime for Native tribes, which doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I think it was much, much more rare as a result of the very different treatment. And Sarah Deer even talks about a Muskogee Creek law. She's Muskogee Creek herself, called What She Say It Be Law, which is essentially if a woman was raped, she would be put in the center of the decision-making process, and she would decide whether the rapist was to be, physically punished, or would he deliver firewood to her for the rest of her life, or how many horses, or how she would, the idea is very restorative justice, which is an Indigenous way of approaching justice, which is how can we restore the victim to her previous stature? How can we repair this harm? Both of the person who was harmed and the whole community, because rape really is a crime that tears apart an individual, but also her family and her whole community. And so I would just urge everyone to read this book. It's actually really, really accessible. It's not hard to read, and it's really insightful, not just for if you care about, male, I'm going to use Lisa's phrasing, male violence against women, but also like American history. There's a lot of American history in this book. So that's my plug.
It sounds like a perfect companion to your film. And this has been such a meaningful conversation, and I hope that we can continue this. For those of you who want to follow the journey of Sisters Rising, they're both on Facebook and Instagram. On Facebook, I'm on Facebook because I'm a middle-aged woman, so Facebook /Sister Rising Movie to follow your wonderful journey with this film. Wendy Schlater, Lisa Bruner, Willow O'Ferrell, thank you all so very much for joining us and for your time. And we thank our audience too. We hope that you enjoyed and gained so much from this discussion as I have. If you enjoyed this film, please be sure to check out our final film of the series, The Archivettes. You can find more information at the Women's Museum of California website. So on behalf of the Women's Museum of California, thank you all so much for joining us, and be well.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Miigwech.
Michelle